Let us pass it, send it back to the House, and hopefully we can get it to the President shortly for signature and help our veterans and help our economy. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I am going to replace you in the chair in a few moments. But before that, I wanted to come over the floor and talk about our economy and some work that this Congress needs to be engaged in if we're going to get things moving on the right track again. Today, the stock market plunged 400 points because of concerns that are going on in Europe, especially with Italy. It's a debt crisis that has been on the front page of every newspaper around the globe for weeks, in some cases months. And I'm reminded of the discussion that we had over the summer that consumed the Congress for an entire summer about the lifting of the debt ceiling. And article after article after article saying if the Congress couldn't figure out how to work this out in a bipartisan way, make a material difference in the trajectory of our deficit and our debt, that for the first time our credit rating would be downgraded. For the first time in the history of the United States of America, the full faith and credit of the United States would be called into question. That was on the front page of every newspaper for weeks. And in the end, we stumbled across that finish line. And in the end, our debt was downgraded. And I would argue that we're about to face the same thing again and have the chance again to do the right thing, to act in a bipartisan way, to create a thoughtful approach to our debt and our deficit that allows us to continue to invest in our economy. The families in Colorado, like the families in Rhode Island, are struggling in an economy that's been the worst recession since the Great Depression. We're coming out of it now, but there are significant structural issues in that economy. Mr. President, I've shown this chart before. It's 4 simple lines. The blue one is the productivity index, which shows that our economy has actually gotten substantially more productive since the early 90s, substantially more productive during this recession for a variety of reasons. One is that our companies have had to learn to compete in a way that they have not before with the rest of the world, so they became more efficient. The benefits that technology has brought has driven this curve up. And unfortunately for our workers, but understandably from our businesses, they've had to figure out how to get through this recession with fewer people so they could get through to the other side. The second curve is our gross domestic product, the size of our domestic economy. And it's not where it was before the recession, but it's headed back there. The other 2 slides are the unemployment level, which this chart says is 14 million people. I think the number is closer to 25. You consider who stopped looking for work and you consider who's underemployed in this economy. And then this line is a tragedy for our families, which is falling median family income. You see on this slide, it's a little hard to read, but it's a pretty good depiction of what's happening here. This red line represents the bottom 90% of income earners in this country. Think about that, Mr. President. We're talking about the bottom 90%. That's everyone, except for 10%. And it shows the share of the income in the United States that they're earning. And it starts out here in the 1920s, and this is today, where the bottom 90% are earning roughly 47% of the income. The last time that was true, by the way, was 1928, the year before the Great Depression and the market crash. The top 0.1% today earns 10% of the economy. 0.1, not 1%, 0.1. The last time that was true was 1928. All through the productive times in the 20th century, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there wasn't that kind of imbalance in our economy. This group earned roughly 90% earned roughly 70% of the economy, and and everybody else earned a fair share, and the economy grew, and we were able to build for the future. Those are structural issues in the economy we can help with, we can work together to fix, but the thing that we have got to do right now is avert predictable crises that are within our control so that we don't make matters worse. And sometimes when I travel, people don't know why we need to worry about what's going on in Europe, and I just this afternoon wanted to bring a slide that shows the soaring debt of all these European economies and the United States. We're the blue line here. This is Greece up here. And everybody is in tough shape. Everybody has made promises that they can't keep. Everybody has levered up in a way that isn't sustainable. But the thing that's also true is that we are all interrelated. And if something bad happens in Europe, something really bad is going to happen here. Just like when the capital markets fell apart at the beginning of the last recession. This slide shows how dependent our economy is on exports to Europe. Between a fifth and a sixth of the total value of our exports goes to Europe. If the European banks fail, if the governments can't pay back their debt and the economy comes to a screeching halt in Europe, they're not going to buy our exports. Those are American jobs that we need to worry about. Those are American jobs that we need to defend and protect. And we need to understand this relationship. Look at the exposure of our U.S. banks to Europe. This red part's the euro area. It's 29% of the total international exposure of our banks, 23% to the U.K. More than half of our foreign exposure of our banks is European debt, Now, we were unable to come to a rational conclusion on the debt ceiling. And so the Congress punted this decision to a supercommittee and said, please help us make the decision. And my own hope is that the supercommittee takes a page out of the bipartisan proposals that were reached, the one that was led by Bowles and Simpson, the one by Rivlin and Domenici. I think the details are less important, frankly, than the size, that take $4 trillion out over the next 10 years, a balance of cuts to revenue of roughly 3 to 1, that sends a message to the world that the United States is serious about dealing with its fiscal matters. If we don't do that in advance of this European crisis that's on the front page of every newspaper in the country, I can assure you, Mr. President, that the choices we have in front of us will be even tougher than they would have otherwise been. And sometimes I get the feeling that people around here actually don't think the American people are watching this screaming match, are watching the disagreements, are watching the political games, but they are. They know exactly what's going on here. And they understand the seriousness of these issues because they're living through that economy I showed you earlier. That's what they're worrying about. They're making less today than they were 10 years ago. They're making the same amount that they were making 20 years ago. And they can't afford to send their kid to college. They can't afford their health care, and they'd like us to help straighten that out, but at a minimum, they'd like us to prevent matters from getting worse. They'd like to see us work together. Some people up here think that Congress has always been unpopular, that it's just as an institution an unpopular place. Not so. Look at this, Mr. President. Here's Congress's approval rating today. 9%. 9%. That's a pretty catastrophic fall-off in the last 10 years, and I would argue that it has an awful lot to do with our inability to address problems the way people in their local communities are doing it. There is not a mayor in Colorado that would threaten the credit rating of their community for politics. Not one. Not a Republican mayor, not a Democratic mayor, not a Tea Party mayor. Not one would imagine doing it for a second, because people in our communities would know that all that would do would be to drive up our interest rates, make us spend more money on interest and less on infrastructure, more on interest and less on education, more on interest and less on the health and welfare of our citizens. We know that at the local level, but somehow here we get to color outside the lines. And we're now at 9%. We're almost at the margin of error for zero. We did some research, Mr. President, to find out what else is at 9%. And we couldn't find virtually anything in public polls taken all across this country. My goodness, the Internal Revenue Service has a 40% approval rating compared to our 9%. BP had a 16% approval rating at the height of the oil spill. And we're at 9%. There's an actress who's at 15%. More people support the United States becoming communist, I don't, for the record, at 11%, than approve of the job that we're doing. I guess we can take some comfort that Fidel Castro is at 5%. Look, we are suffering, and when I say we, I mean families across this country, through the worst recession since the Great Depression. We can see on the front page of every single newspaper what the stakes are here if we don't act in a comprehensive way on our debt and our deficit. We know that both parties have different approaches to the challenges that we face. But at the end of the day, these challenges are the challenges of the American people, not the challenges of a bunch of politicians in Washington that are worrying about the next election. And so my hope is that the supercommittee shows leadership here, that it gives the opportunity for every member of this body to express their leadership here, and that all of us are able to go home to red parts of our state and blue parts of our state and say to people, we saw the problem coming and we led the world. We materially addressed the problem that we faced. We acted in a bipartisan way. We came up with a plan that said, you know what, we're all in this together for the benefit of our kids and our grandkids, for the people that are suffering through this economy. There is $2.3 trillion of cash sitting on companies' balance sheets in the United States of America tonight that is not being invested because no one knows what interest rate environment they're going to be in, because they don't know what Washington's going to do. We shattered confidence in this economy this summer. We shouldn't do it again. This is a popular number, this 9 these days, you may have noticed, Mr. President, on the presidential campaign trail. It's not a popular number for the American people, 9% approval. Let's do something right here, and let's drive these numbers back up, and let's restore confidence in the American people. With that, Mr. President, thank you for your patience, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of Senate Joint Resolution 6, a resolution of disapproval of the FCC's net neutrality order. Over the last 2 years, the Federal Communications Commission has put forward a variety of what are considered net neutrality policies. On September the 23rd of this year, the FCC published a final rule in the Federal Register, which is set to go into effect on November 20th to impose harmful net neutrality regulations on our nation's telecommunications companies. The digital world in which we now live, Mr. President, has changed dramatically the way that we retrieve information, communicate with one another, and engage in commerce. Technological advances, even the last few years, have pushed our economy forward. These advancements in technology and their adoption often depend heavily on access to broadband technologies. While the telecommunications industry has flourished, boosted our economy, and made critical investments in broadband deployment across the country, this administration believes that imposing additional regulations is a step in the right direction. In places across the country, like my home state of South Dakota, there is still work to be done when it comes to unfettered and affordable access to high-speed broadband. With the FCC voting recently to reform the Universal Service Fund to shift to a focus on broadband deployment, it seems to me that simultaneously moving forward with net neutrality regulations will have a chilling effect on this now thriving industry. We learned last week from the Department of Labor that the unemployment rate still hovers around 9%, Mr. President. The American people want to see federal policies that encourage innovation and spur job growth, not yet another regulatory overreach by an overzealous agency. Unfortunately, the FCC net neutrality policy will give considerable authority to unelected bureaucrats to decide what a company's network management should look like. The federal courts have ruled that the FCC lacks the authority under the Telecommunications Act of 1996 to move forward with net neutrality regulations. Still, the Democratic appointees of the FCC have persisted, without regard to the courts, to settle the political debt owed by the Obama administration to special interest groups in favor of regulating the Internet. The FCC and this administration must be brought into line and abide by the separation of powers. The FCC must only execute the responsibilities given to it by Congress and not overreach its regulatory authority. Mr. President, freedom of the Internet belongs in the marketplace, not in the hands of federal regulators. The FCC has moved forward to fix a problem that does not exist. Mr. President, this is a solution in search of a problem. Industry-imposed standards and transparency have the capability to increase competition, while more unnecessary government regulations will almost certainly have the opposite effect. Under a light regulatory structure, the Internet has become vital to commerce and our nation's economy over the past 15 years. The Internet has helped digitally shrink the distance that otherwise would inhibit the free flow of ideas, information, and business transactions from one part of the world to another. The Internet's adaptability and decentralized characteristics are central to that success. This federal regulatory action represents unnecessary government overreach and has the potential to seriously damage an increasingly important sector of our economy. I don't believe that the federal government can successfully regulate network access and development without negative effects on the consumer or the industry. Allowing this unnecessary regulation to move forward has the potential to stifle broadband deployment and competition, which could ultimately lead to fewer choices for consumers, higher prices, and discourage innovation. I believe the net neutrality regulations, if allowed to move forward, will have negative effects on this industry and our economy, and I would encourage my colleagues, Mr. President, tomorrow to support this resolution of disapproval. The economy doesn't need this, our job creators don't need this, and the millions of Americans who are benefiting from the information revolution that's been brought about by the Internet don't need this either. This is an opportunity for us to send a little bit of a message to industry that we understand, we get what they're saying about overregulation. We get that these piles of regulations continue to drive up the cost of doing business in this country. And as my colleague, the presiding officer, noted in his remarks, the need for economic certainty. Businesses need to know what the rules are going to be. It seems to me, at least, that creating a whole set of new rules and piling new regulations on this very important medium in a way that which we have grown commerce in this country, opened up markets across the world, created opportunities for consumers in this country to become more productive with their lives, is an absolute wrong approach at this particular point in time, particularly with the unemployment rate being what it is. We want to make it less expensive, less costly, easier for our job creators to create jobs in this country, not put unnecessary barriers and more obstacles and drive up the cost and make it more difficult for people in this country to create jobs. Businesses are looking for economic uncertainty. They're looking to Washington, D.C. for policies that will lessen the impediments and the number of obstacles to job creation in this country. And I also want to mention in that vein, Mr. President, that earlier today I introduced a piece of legislation called the Access to Capital for Job Creators Act. This bill would make it easier for small businesses to better access capital in order to expand and create jobs. If you think about the things that the job creators around the country want and need in order for them to get that capital off the sidelines, to get out of cash and to get invested again and get that money back into our economy and back into creating jobs, they want to see a government that lives within its means. They want to see a government that doesn't spend money it doesn't have. And so we've got to be serious about cutting spending here at the federal level and getting back to more of a historic norm when it comes to the cost of our government as a percentage of our entire economy. Historically, for the past 40 years, that's run in the 20 to 21% range. That's what we spend on the federal government as a percentage of our entire GDP. Now it's up in the 24 to 25% range. That means that the federal government as a percentage of our entire economy is growing relative to our private economy. We want to see the private economy grow and expand and the federal economy, Mr. President, get smaller. Our job creators also want to see our tax code reformed in a way that is simple, clear, and fair, and that provides the right types of incentives for them to create jobs and doesn't drive investment overseas and create jobs there as opposed to creating those jobs right here at home. And so if we can get tax reform that lowers rates on individuals and businesses and broadens the tax base in this country, I think you will see an explosion of economic growth, which is ultimately the best solution that we can possibly have to all the challenges, fiscal and economic challenges that our country faces. Our job creators want smart, common sense regulations, not more and more regulation for regulation's sake, which is, I think, what we see a lot today. We've seen bill after bill have passed the House of Representatives that is designed to sort of roll back the overregulation, the regulatory overreach that we've seen from this administration. Many of those bills have come over here to the Senate where they have died, unfortunately. But we need to be looking at these things in a way that will, again, lower the impediments, lower the barriers, lower the hurdles to job creation in this country. And that's why I think smart, common sense regulation is the way to go, and to get away from the regulatory overreach that we're seeing all too much of today. We need affordable energy policies, opening up access to the vast resources that we have in this country. We need to open up markets around the world and look at ways that we can make our small businesses, create more opportunities for them to export their products to other places around the world. But the legislation that I introduced today, Mr. President, addresses yet another issue, which I think small businesses have talked about, and that is access to capital. And we need to better address the need for capital in order to create jobs and expand our economy. Last week, the House of Representatives passed this very bill. It was introduced by Representative Kevin McCarthy, and on a near unanimous vote in the House of Representatives of 413 to 11, they passed this legislation and sent it this direction. This bill would allow small businesses to better attract capital from accredited investors nationwide under Rule 506 of Regulation D of the Securities Act of 1933 by removing the general solicitation provision. Now, that sounds like a lot of Washington speak, and it is. But the very simple translation of that, Mr. President, is this will make it easier for small businesses to access the much-needed capital they need to expand and grow their businesses. This provision is a roadblock in its current form for small businesses that are looking to obtain needed capital because it requires investors to have a pre-existing relationship with an issuer or intermediary before the potential investor can be notified that unregistered securities are available for sale. So if you had a small business that's looking for investors, unless they have a pre-existing relationship with that investor, They can't, there's no way for them to get the message out that they are looking for capital to those with whom they don't have that kind of a relationship already in place. The provision as it currently exists severely hampers the ability for small businesses to obtain needed capital from investors, and as a result, many businesses are limited to only the universe of investors with which they clearly have these pre-existing relationships. This legislation would remove that solicitation, prohibition, and allow businesses to attract capital from accredited investors nationwide. Mr. President, with unemployment at 9%, we need to pass legislation that will enable our job creators to expand and to create jobs. As I said, this bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. I would hope that we can do the same thing here in the United States Senate and address this very fundamental need among our businesses, our small businesses in this country, to get access to much-needed capital to expand their businesses. That, along with using a common-sense approach to regulation, an approach that gets away from this massive 61,000 pages of new regulations that we've seen issued since this administration took office, to tax reform that is simple, that is clear, that is fair, that provides incentives to keep jobs here at home as opposed to shipping them overseas, affordable energy policies, reducing government spending, improving export opportunities for our small businesses. Those are the types of policies that our job creators have said that they need. We're going to have an opportunity to vote on the rollback of this net neutrality regulation and on some other regulations tomorrow that are making it more difficult, more costly for our businesses, our small businesses, to create jobs in this country. I hope that we will see strong bipartisan support in both with respect to the regulation, the disapproval regulation, or disapproval resolution, I should say, that we're going to be voting on net neutrality, as well as the one on cross-state air permitting. So those are both things that I think will do a lot to make it less expensive for small businesses in this country to create jobs, and I would hope as well that we will look at other opportunities in the form of the legislation introduced by Senator McCain, Senator Portman, and others that has a whole series of the things that I just mentioned, all of which will create jobs and grow our economy, make this country more prosperous and stronger, and put us on a more sound economic and fiscal footing as we head into the days ahead. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Hey, Tim. Mr. President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I am here this evening to express my unwavering support for the men and women who have answered the call of duty in our military services, our Guard and Reserve, and for their family members whose love and steady support for them have carried our service members through challenging times and difficult missions. In honor of Veterans Day, coming up tomorrow, and Military Family Month, which we observe all month long this November, we need to reflect on the enormous contributions that military families have made on behalf of all of us. Since September 11th, the spouses, children, and parents of our servicemen and women have been faced with huge demands. They've endured repeated deployments and spent many holidays and birthdays and anniversaries apart from each other. We should do everything we can in our communities to help military families cope with the difficulties and stresses of these multiple deployments. I commend First Lady Michelle Obama and Dr. Jill Biden for their commitment to our troops' families and for their work on initiatives to address the unique challenges that military families face in this environment. I especially appreciate the First Lady's recent visit to Rhode Island. It provided a warm and welcome boost to military family members in my state, which has the second highest per capita National Guard deployment rate of all the states, as well as a significant active duty presence at Naval Station Newport. With so many men and women leaving home to serve on multiple deployments, the strain on the family can be particularly difficult. Last month, I had the privilege of meeting two extraordinary Rhode Island students, Kathleen Callahan, who goes by Katie, and Caitlin Hawley, who presented a powerful and compelling message to school superintendents and educators from across Rhode Island who came together to learn about how they can better respond to the particular needs of military families. These two impressive young ladies shared their personal stories and described the challenges their families faced while their parent was deployed. The event was part of a collaborative initiative to help military-connected children thrive in school through deployments. I was proud to share in this joint effort with the Rhode Island National Guard, with Governor Chafee, with our Commissioner of Education, the Commanding Officer of Naval Station Newport, our Military Child Education Coalition, and my senior Senator Jack Reed. Katie is the daughter of a National Guard member. She described how her father's deployment affected the roles in her family. Like most children of deployed service members, Katie assumed additional responsibilities in caring for her younger sibling and helping her mother, whom she referred to as a superwoman. Together, they shouldered the burden of her father's absence and kept the family intact and sound. Katie described the feeling of, to use her words, silent suffering that can occur when military families feel isolated in civilian communities that may not completely understand what it's like when a loved one is deployed. Caitlin is the daughter of an active duty member. She talked about her experience living in 8 different states and attending 7 different schools. Caitlin is a highly motivated student, and she explained how she threw herself into her schoolwork during her father's deployment. However, she cautioned that for other students, the opposite can also occur. Some students may have a lot of difficulty focusing on their schoolwork when a parent is deployed half a world away. As Caitlin so well put it, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to coping with the stress of deployments. I am proud of Katie and Caitlin for their courage, their resilience, and their powerful articulation of a message that I hope everyone hears. We owe our military families an enduring debt of gratitude for everything they have done. We should do everything we can to ensure that no family feels isolated or left out or endures the silent suffering that Katie described. I hope every American, as we approach Veterans Day, will actively support our military families and do what we can to make our communities more welcoming and supportive in accommodating their needs. As Veterans Day approaches, let's celebrate our military families and recognize their extraordinary contribution. Let us thank not only our servicemen and women, but also the spouses, children, and other family members that have shared in the sacrifice of military service. And we should also remember the families of our civilian and intelligence service members deployed in danger and away from their families around the world. In concluding, I'd like to also express my strong support for the bipartisan legislation the Senate is considering to boost employment opportunities for veterans. Unemployment has been disproportionately high among veterans, and we must act now. The last thing our returning servicemen and women need is to have to face an unemployment line. I urge my colleagues to swiftly pass this much-needed legislation, which I am very proud to co-sponsor. I thank the presiding officer, and I will yield the floor for the senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak in support of the Vow to Hire Heroes Act of 2011, which has been offered as an amendment by my friend from Montana, Senator Jon Tester. This Friday is Veterans Day. On this day, every year, Americans join together to honor the men and women in uniform who have served and sacrificed for our country. Think of the work we do for our veterans. Some of it is very small. Small to us, but not small to them. We have people call our office all the time, Mr. President, when there are mess-ups with their benefits, when red tape gets in the way. I'll never forget one last year where one of the Patriot Guard who stands outside and holds the flag during funerals for our service members, she came to me in tears and said that her son had been badly hurt serving our country. In fact, he had lost his leg. And when he came back, he was at Walter Reed. He was fit with a prosthetic leg, and then he came home. And when he was trying to get his benefits, he was told he couldn't get his benefits for losing his leg. This is a true story, because the records had been lost that showed that he lost his leg. He had no leg. We worked on it, and within a week, we got his benefits. And those stories are all told across the country. There is red tape. We must all help them. But it just goes to show when you see those stories what our young soldiers are doing every single day. This also means fighting for legislation to fulfill America's promise that we will care for our soldiers when they return. When our soldiers signed up to fight for our country, there wasn't a waiting line. And when they come home to the United States of America and they need a job, or they need a home, or they need medical care, or they need an education, there shouldn't be a waiting line in our country. Yet sadly, when you look at the past decades, too often there is. When I came into the Senate, as my friend in Rhode Island came in 2006, we all remember the horror stories with our veterans' health care. We remember what had happened at our medical hospitals. We remember the stories of soldiers getting lost in the cracks. And that's why we worked so hard to make sure that they got the health care that they deserved. We provided for historic funding increases to ensure top-quality health care for America's service members and military retirees. We also passed the post-9/11 GI Bill to expand educational benefits for veterans who have served in the past decade. But there is more work to be done to support our veterans. Consider two shocking facts, Mr. President. The unemployment rate for Minnesota veterans who have served since 9/11 is nearly 23%. The third highest in the nation, yet our unemployment rate is one of the lower ones in the nation. Our unemployment rate is 2 points better than the national average. Yet for veterans, it's almost double the national average for veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and more than 3 times our state's overall unemployment rate. Second fact, an estimated 700 Minnesota veterans are homeless on any given night. And during the course of the year, an estimated 4,000 Minnesota veterans will experience an episode of homelessness or a crisis that could lead to homelessness. This is just not right. That's why I'm calling on my colleagues today to vote to support the Vow to Hire Heroes Act. This important bill goes a long way in providing our returning veterans the leg up they need in transitioning into the workforce. To list just a few important provisions of this bill, it encourages companies to hire unemployed veterans by offering them tax credits to do so. The bill provides employers a tax credit of up to $5,600 for hiring veterans who have been looking for a job for more than 6 months, as well as a $2,400 credit for veterans who are unemployed for more than 4 weeks. The bill also provides employers a tax credit of up to $9,600 for hiring veterans with service-connected disabilities who have been looking for a job for more than 6 months. Second, the VOW Act increases training for returning veterans so that by the time they step out of their uniform, they have the skills and the tools they need to get out there and market themselves to find a job. The bill does this by making it a requirement for returning troops to participate in the Transition Assistance Program, a job training boot camp coordinated by the Department of Defense, Labor and Veterans Affairs that teaches veterans how to get those jobs, write those resumes, apply their military skills to civilian jobs. Third, the VOW Act expands education benefits for older veterans, people who aren't eligible for the post-9/11 Veterans GI Bill. The bill provides 100,000 unemployed veterans of past eras and wars with up to 1 year of additional Montgomery GI benefits to go toward education or training programs at community colleges or technical schools. Fourth, the VOW Act ensures that disabled veterans receive up to 1 year of additional vocational rehabilitation and employment benefits. And last, the VOW Act allows service members to begin the federal employment process prior to separation to help them transition seamlessly into jobs at the VA, the Department of Homeland Security, or the many other federal agencies that could use their skills and their dedication. The fact is that our returning veterans are battle-tested, they are valuable to employers, they can work in all kinds of fields. Helping our veterans turn the skills they learned in the military into good-paying jobs not only honors our promise to support those who have sacrificed for our nation, it also helps strengthen our nation. One of my top priorities in the Senate has been to cut through the red tape and streamline credentialing for service members who have achieved certain skill sets through their military training. I'm offering an amendment to the VOW Act that will streamline credentialing for returning military paramedics. I learned about this one time when I was driving around our state, and I met a number of those who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They served as paramedics there. They served on the front lines. They learned incredible skills of how to save lives, yet those skills weren't all transferable into becoming paramedics once they came back to the United States. Yet at the same time, we have an incredible shortage of paramedics in our rural areas. So I am going to introduce this as an amendment that would fix this problem by encouraging states to give paramedics credit for the military medical training that they've received. Not only does this help our veterans, it also helps relieve the shortage of emergency medical personnel in the rural areas. With common sense solutions like these and the common sense solutions contained in the VOW Act, I believe we can help our returning veterans transition into the workforce, not only fulfilling our commitment to them, but also helping to lift our economy. Having traveled in the western part of our state in the last few weeks, I cannot tell you the number of job openings right now for welders, for tool and die. I've been at companies that literally have dozens of openings, not always even starting jobs, engineers. They want this military personnel, and they need to connect with them, and we need to encourage our employers to hire these veterans when they come back from serving our country. Our state has always been a state that understands the debt we owe to the men and women who have served and sacrificed for us. We literally wrap our arms around those who have served. I want to end with a story from last Veterans Day. When after doing our statewide event, I headed up to Wadena, Minnesota, which was an area that had been torn apart, a little town, by a tornado, literally a mile ripped up. Their school was destroyed, a high school bleachers 3 blocks from where they had been. So on Veterans Day, they held their annual event. They could no longer have it at the high school. The high school was destroyed. They could no longer have it at some of the other places that they used to be, so they were all in an elementary school. The entire town, all the high school kids, all the veterans, sitting on these old bleachers in that elementary school. And I got to speak there. And what I'll never forget is that the elementary kids sang a song that I had never heard before, but I heard the melody, and I remembered the Ken Burns movie from World War II, and it was a song from that movie. And this is what the lyrics are. They said, "All we've been given by those who came before, the dream of a nation where freedom would endure. The work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What will our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings that I received. Let me know in my heart when my days are through, America, America, I gave my best to you." And that's what those elementary kids sang after their whole school had been torn apart with those veterans at their side. America, America, I gave my best to you. So I think that's what we have to remember as we approach this vote on this VOW Act. This vote that to me is so simple that we simply give a tax credit so that more employers will hire those who sacrificed for our country, who gave their best for our country. That's what this vote is about. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, it seems fairly recently that this summer I came to the floor to commend the Environmental Protection Agency for finalizing what we call the cross-state air pollution rule, which limits the out-of-state pollution that one state can dump into the wind currents to drop on other states. My state, Rhode Island, this is particularly important to. Nearly a decade after the EPA began working to address this problem of interstate air pollution, we finally had a path forward that is sensible and protective of public health. That was then. This is now. Today, Senator Paul of Kentucky proposes to halt this progress, to undo that rule through a Congressional Review Act resolution. That resolution would, one, void the cross-state air pollution rule, and two, bar EPA permanently from ever writing a substantially similar rule. This means that EPA could never use the Clean Air Act to create a cost-effective pollution trading program to address upwind pollution. Mr. President, this hits home in my state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island has the sixth highest rate of asthma in the country. More than 11% of the people in my state suffer from this chronic disease, and many of them are children. In 2009, there were 1,750 hospital discharges in Rhode Island for asthma cases. Those hospital stays cost about $8 million in direct medical costs, not to mention the costs of the medication or missed days of work and school. On a clear summer day in Rhode Island, driving along sparkling Narragansett Bay, commuting into work, you will often hear the warning on drive time radio, today is a bad air day in Rhode Island. Infants, seniors, people with breathing difficulties should stay indoors today. On those days, people in those categories are forced to stay at home, missing work, missing school, missing other important activities. Others, even in good health, are urged to avoid strenuous activities on these bad air days. These are real costs. These are costs paid in lives, in reduced quality of life, in medical bills, in public services strained responding to health risks, in missed days of work and school, all from pollution in our air. Now, we don't know everything about the causes and cures of asthma, but we do know one thing, and that is that air pollution triggers asthma attacks. And we know that air pollution is a preventable problem. Rhode Island has worked hard and made great strides to reduce air pollution. We passed laws to prohibit cars and buses from idling with their engines on and to retrofit all state school buses with diesel pollution controls. We require heavy-duty vehicles used in federally funded construction projects to install diesel pollution controls, adhere to our anti-idling law, and use only low-sulfur diesel. Our transit agency voluntarily retrofitted half its bus fleet with diesel pollution control equipment. But Rhode Island can't solve its air pollution problem on its own. In fact, Doug McVeigh, who's acting as chief of Rhode Island's Office of Air Resources, told me that all of Rhode Island's major sources of air pollution, not just power plants, but any source that holds a, quote, major Title V permit, all of them emit less than 3,000 tons a year of nitrogen oxide, also called NOx, and sulfur dioxide, also called SOx. Let me repeat that. All major sources in Rhode Island taken together emit annually less than 3,000 tons of these two pollutants. Polluters that will be subject to the cross-state air pollution rule in other states have single units that emit more than that. Some of the larger coal-fired boilers may emit 10 to 12,000 tons of these pollutants every year, nearly 4 times the pollution emitted by all Rhode Island major sources combined. In Rhode Island, we are willing to pull our weight in achieving air pollution reductions. Indeed, we have done more than pull our own weight. We are pulling above our weight. But we need all states to be pulling their weight, too, to make the air safe to breathe in America from coast to coast. This year, at my request, the GAO completed a report about tall smokestacks at coal power plants. The report found that in 1970, the year the Clean Air Act was enacted, there were 2 what they call tall stacks, smokestacks over 500 feet in the United States. 2. By 1985, there were more than 180 tall stacks. As of 2010, 284 tall smokestacks were operating at 172 coal power plants, representing 64% of the coal generating capacity in our country. The industry literally smokestacked its way into compliance with the Clean Air Act. What do I mean by that? Well, in the early days of the Clean Air Act, some states allowed sources of pollution to build tall smokestacks instead of installing pollution controls. The concept was back then that pollution sent high enough into the atmosphere would be sent far away from the source and would not contribute to air pollution problems, at least in that state. Well, turns out this air pollution causes problems downwind in other states. As the GAO report put it, tall stacks generally disperse pollutants over greater distances than shorter stacks and provide pollutants greater time to react in the atmosphere to form ozone and particulate matter. For this antiquated practice, Rhode Island pays the price. Smokestacking instead of scrubbing is what is behind a lot of the ozone in Rhode Island that gives rise to those bad air days. The GAO found that more than half of the boilers attached to tall stacks at coal power plants do not have a scrubber to control sulfur dioxide emissions. More than half. No scrubber, just a tall smokestack to pump it out to the downwind state. Nearly 2/3 of boilers connected to tall stacks do not have post-combustion controls for nitrogen oxide. So how does it get to Rhode Island? As the GAO concluded, in the mid-Atlantic United States, the wind generally blows from west to east. Ozone can travel hundreds of miles with the help of high-speed winds known as the low-level jet. This phenomenon typically occurs at night due to the ground cooling quicker than the upper atmosphere, which can allow the low-level jet to form and transport ozone and particulate matter with its high winds. This wind map shows that condition. These are all the Midwestern power plants, and this is the wind that carries them down here to, among other states, Rhode Island. 5 states on this map, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Illinois, and North Carolina, have been identified by EPA as contributing significantly to Rhode Island pollution. This electricity that comes from uncontrolled power plants tied to these tall smokestacks, it might seem cheaper to consumers than a well-controlled power plant, a power plant that's scrubbed instead of smokestacking its pollution? But that is really not so. There are costs. The cost just got shifted. The lungs of children and seniors in Rhode Island and other downwind states pay for that cheap electricity. And frankly, truth be told, the lungs of children and seniors in many of the upwind states are paying as well. The states upwind of Rhode Island are downwind of someone else. Ohio and Pennsylvania are upwind of Rhode Island, but they're downwind of other states. That's why EPA's regulatory impact analysis determined that in-state and upwind pollution reductions from this rule will save approximately 3,209 lives in Ohio and 2,911 lives in Pennsylvania every year by 2014, and prevent hundreds of heart attacks, emergency room visits, and hospitalizations in those states. This rule, proposed by Senator Paul, opposed by Senator Paul, will even save an estimated 1,705 lives in his home state of Kentucky every year by 2014. And it's not just lives saved. EPA estimates by 2014 that the benefits from this rule will range between $110 billion and $280 billion. At the same time, EPA estimates that the rule will cost utilities $4.1 billion to comply in 2012 and another $0.8 billion through 2014. Grand total, what, $4.9 billion against $110 to $280 billion in quantifiable benefits. At the lower end of the range, this rule generates a 22-to-1 ratio of benefits over costs. For every dollar in cost to the polluters who are creating this pollution to clean it up, there is $22 in benefit to the rest of the country. That's a pretty good investment, and that's at the low end. At the high end, if it's $280 billion, we're talking about a 56-to-1 ratio of benefits over costs. We have people from polluting states to save a buck for their polluters who are running it up smokestacks instead of scrubbing their pollution, to save the buck in putting the scrubber and quit smokestacking their pollution and dumping it on Rhode Island and other states. They're willing to blow $56 in benefits to Americans across the country, even in their states. It doesn't make any sense. This rule, the cross-air rule, is good for public health. It is fair. There is no other way that Rhode Island can affect these states. We've done everything we can to clean our air. We could stop everything, and we would still be a non-attainment clean air quality state because of what gets bombed in on us from other states. If we don't have EPA defending us, we have no defense at all from states that choose to export their pollution rather than clean it up. And it's very, very cost effective, better than 51 by the highest estimates. So that is why I will be voting against Senator Paul's resolution to void this rule. I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield the floor. I would withdraw and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I rise this evening to join my colleague from Rhode Island and those who have been to the floor throughout the day today to join them in strong opposition to the efforts by Senator Paul to nullify the Environmental Protection Agency's cross-state air pollution rule. As we've heard on the floor, his resolution would strip the EPA of its authority to protect our air from certain kinds of air pollution emitted by power plants. That rule was put in place specifically to protect downwind states like New Hampshire and those of us in the Northeast and on the East Coast from air pollution that originates from outside our borders. I am particularly concerned by the attempts to stop these protections because in New Hampshire, we've been fighting for them for over a decade, and they are long overdue. Clean air is a bipartisan matter for us in New Hampshire. As my friend and colleague, Senator Ayotte, noted on the floor last night, in New Hampshire, we have a long bipartisan tradition of working to advance common sense, balanced environmental protections. I couldn't agree with her more. She and I know that even if we eliminated all local sources of air pollution from within New Hampshire's borders, we would still have counties in the state with unacceptably high levels of pollution. That's because of the overwhelming pollution that comes into New Hampshire and the Northeast on air currents from the Midwest. In the Northeast, we're considered the tailpipe for the rest of the country. That's why in 1997, when I was governor, New Hampshire joined with 7 other Northeast states to demand that the EPA begin cracking down on this transported air pollution. When New Hampshire joined that effort in 1997, this is what I said about it. When you climb Mount Washington in New Hampshire and see smog that's blown in from the Midwest, it's clearly time for a national crackdown on air pollution. It's time to address the major sources of pollution that are fouling our air and affecting the health of our people. We've done our part in New Hampshire to cut down on emissions, and it's time for the EPA to get tough on major polluters upwind. I have here a picture of the White Mountains, which is where Mount Washington is. That's the highest point in New Hampshire and actually in the whole Northeast. And what this picture shows very clearly is the impact of this air pollution that's coming in from upwind. So we can see these are the White Mountains on a clear day. You can see beautiful blue sky, green trees, beautiful landscape. On a hazy day, this is the impact of that smog. It looks like somebody took a gray paintbrush and painted over the White Mountains in New Hampshire. It's really unbelievable to me that we're here 14 years later after this action was brought in 1997, still debating transported air pollution. The time for debate is over. The air quality improvements from this rule will benefit over 289,000 children who are at risk for asthma in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has one of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country. In my state alone, air pollution is estimated to cost businesses more than 17,000 lost days of work annually due to health problems. And yet, we're still hearing the same old arguments that forcing polluters to clean up will hurt the economy, will hurt our businesses. No, in fact, we've got lots of research that shows that that's not true. Talking points about job-killing regulations ignore the fact that in a recent economic analysis by the Political Economy Research Institute, they found that the EPA's cross-state air pollution rule and the proposed mercury rule will create 290,000 jobs per year over the next 5 years in important sectors of our economy like construction, craft labor, and industrial manufacturing. And companies like Thermo Fisher Scientific, which has a plant in Newington, New Hampshire, is a leading manufacturer of environmental monitoring equipment and a great example that good policy creates jobs right here in the United States. By reducing air pollution, these protections are estimated to provide about $640 million in benefits to the New Hampshire economy alone. Nationwide, the health and environmental benefits are estimated at $120 to $280 billion each year. That's because when air pollution comes across our state borders, it's our New Hampshire companies who are forced to make up the difference. Without these rules, we have an unfair system where the burden of keeping our air clean falls disproportionately on downwind states like New Hampshire. Higher air pollution costs our businesses through the loss of worker productivity and greater medical expenses, and it also affects our critical tourism industry in New Hampshire, which depends on the clean air of the White Mountains and the health of our beautiful lakes and forests and streams. In New Hampshire, this tourism industry and the outdoor recreation economy, much like in Colorado, where the President's from, supports 53,000 jobs. It generates $260 million per year in sales taxes, and it accounts for 8% of our state's gross domestic product. Transported air pollution has a direct impact on this industry, as we can see so clearly in this photograph, and on the quality of life of New Hampshire's 1.3 million citizens. It's time for the EPA to move forward with their cross-state air pollution rule. I urge all of my colleagues in the Senate to reject this resolution by Senator Paul and to protect the health and welfare of all of the citizens in this country. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.